And Jesus said, therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Wait, did he just tell us to be like Satan? Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Espresso with Sky, giving you a fresh perspective on faith, life, God, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Sky. Over here are my two sidekicks. If you haven't done so, go ahead, hit all those crazy buttons. But the most important one is, please leave your honest opinion on today's topic in the comments. If you want to support this ministry, we got PayPal and buymeacoffee.com. So let's get into this really interesting topic. There are some profound and deep sayings by Jesus in the Bible. And then there are some things that are a little bit confusing, like Matthew chapter 10. Now, in this chapter, Jesus sends out the 12 to go preach the gospel. He instructs them on what to do. He warns them of what is ahead. And then he says to them, if you want to succeed, you got to be like this. In verse 16, he says, therefore, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Like snakes? Isn't Satan considered a snake? Is this right? Is Jesus really saying be like Satan? What does it really mean? First, let's break the misunderstanding we have about snakes. Now, since the story of Adam and Eve, snakes have had a really bad reputation because in that story, Satan is a snake. And all of a sudden people freak out and say, oh no, all snakes are Satan. And then they won't allow you to have pet snakes. And then even if you have one, and if that snake one day bites you, they're gonna be like, ooh, see, I told you it's from Satan. But then if you go by that reasoning, it doesn't make any sense, because that would mean that dogs and cats and hamsters and rabbits would all be from Satan because they bite their owners too. Actually, almost every animal has bitten their owner at least once. So does that mean all animals are from Satan? And the answer is absolutely not. So let's go a little bit deeper into this. Let's look at Acts chapter 10, and we're going to see this story where Peter is hungry. Then he sees a vision of a sheep coming out of heaven, and all these animals, including birds and reptiles, which include snakes, are all there. And God says, eat. Peter says, oh, I will never eat anything unclean. And God's like, in verse 15, he says, do not call anything impure that God has made clean. Now, that's very interesting. What does he say? Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. So here we're like, oh, what is God really trying to say? And of course, in the context of this verse, spiritually speaking, it's talking about preaching the gospel to Gentiles, which were considered unclean. But it's also talking physically, because as you see, now in the New Testament, people who believe in Christ, we're freed from the old laws. So if you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, what does it say? We have become ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. We are ministers of a new covenant with new laws. And what kind of laws are these? We're not bound by these physical laws of don't eat this, you can eat this, don't eat that. Let me tell you honestly, what I've eaten in my life, I've had bear, I've had horse, I've had snails, I have kangaroos, and guess what? If this was the Old Testament time, all of them would be impure. So the question is, would I go to hell? Would I be unclean because I ate those things? In the Old Testament, I would, but as ministers of a new covenant, we are not bound by that law, and what we eat doesn't really matter. So, if you look at Matthew chapter 15, verse 11, what does Jesus say? It doesn't matter what goes into your mouth and what comes out of your mouth, because that comes from your heart. What goes into your mouth doesn't make you bad. If I eat really bad food all the time, it doesn't make me a bad person. And we all understand this. But if I eat good food, does that make me a good person? Absolutely not. Why? It's about our hearts. It's about the inside. And I don't think when we go to heaven, God is going to ask us an extra question. Like he's going to be like, do you believe in Jesus? Yes, I do. Wait, one last question. Do you have a pet snake? Do you really think he's going to ask that? No, we know that ministers of this new covenant, we are not bound by the letter, but of the Spirit. It is spiritual. And God's going to ask that one question of, do you believe? Right? That's the major thing. It's not about, did you eat this or did you eat that? So there's the first thing. So let's move on to the next part of this. How do I understand snakes better in the Bible? So let's take a look at why the Bible calls Satan a snake. Now, one thing we do know is the Bible is written in a symbolic or parable form. Of course, not the entire Bible, but many parts of it is written in this way. What are parables? Comparing two things that are alike. My friend calls me a pig. Why? Because I eat too much or I could be fat, right? Because we're comparing two things that are alike. We have similar characteristics. Now, snakes. What is a characteristic of a snake? Number one is they don't have legs. Now, why is that significant? Because you can never hear them coming. They're just slithering on the ground. You can't hear the footsteps like, oh, someone's chasing me. No, a snake is quiet. It is sly. It is cunning, and you have no idea when it's next to you. And then out of nowhere, it bites you. You're like, oh, what's going on? And then we die. In the same way, what about Satan? Satan is invisible. Satan is a spirit. When do you hear him coming? You can't. You don't hear him, you don't see him, and like a snake, it just comes and strikes our hearts. And in that moment, what happens? We fall into temptation. We get tested, right? And all these things happen to us because Satan comes like a snake. It is a similar characteristic. Now, here's the thing. The Bible doesn't just talk about snakes in a bad way. There are also good ways that the Bible talks about snakes. Take a look at Genesis chapter 49, verse 17. Jacob is blessing his 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel, and one of his sons named Dan is called a serpent, right? He called him a serpent by the roadside. Now, is he condemning his son and saying, oh, Dan, your tribe, you are Satan. You are just going to hell. Is that what Jacob is doing to his son? Absolutely not. He's using a characteristic of a snake and saying, wow, Dan's character is similar to that. Now, is the snake bad? Is the snake good? No, it depends on who it's being compared to. Example, let me give you another parable that has both a good and a bad side to it, just like the snakes. Let's talk about rocks. Are rocks good or bad? And the answer is neither. Rocks are just rocks. However, you know what Jesus says to Peter? In Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, he says, Peter, you are a rock. And on this rock, I will build my church. Now, is he saying, oh, Peter, you idiot, you have a head like a rock, you're a moron? Or is he saying, like a rock that is strong and hard, we can build a church. It'll be a great foundation. It's a good thing because Peter is good. He's using the characteristic of a rock in a good way for a good person. However, if you go to Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 9, God's saying like, hey, these people's foreheads are like the hardest stones. So now rocks are being compared to people who are stubborn and don't turn away from their sin. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's a bad thing. However, is it the rock that is bad or good? Or is it that characteristic that's being compared to the person who is bad or good? It's about the characteristic. It's not that parable itself. Snakes are not all bad. Snakes aren't Satan. I wish they were, because if snakes were Satan, it'd be so easy, because all we would have to do is kill every snake in the world and there'd be no more Satans in the world. Wouldn't that be so easy? But we know Satan was an angel, right? He's unseen, he's invisible, and like a snake, he is crafty and cunning, and he strikes us without even knowing. A spiritual being we cannot see, he just influences our hearts. So when we look at the Bible, yes, these parables, the snake itself isn't bad, it's just the characteristic that is being used for a good person or a bad person, all right? So snakes are not Satan. Satan is compared to a snake, but it doesn't mean all snakes are Satan. All right, so now that we got this, let's move into this last point. What does Jesus mean when he says, be as shrewd as snakes? So finally, let's take a look at Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. And what did Jesus really mean when he said, be as shrewd as snakes? So first, let's take a look at the definition of the word shrewd, which is given to wily, crafty, and artful ways or dealing. Be as shrewd as snakes. snakes. Now, before he says this, though, in Matthew 10:16, he actually says we are sheep among wolves, which means wolves are those that attack and hunt down sheep. And we're in a world where a lot of people don't prescribe and some are aggressively against us. So we must be as shrewd as snakes. So what are snakes like? Well, one thing you have to know about snakes is snakes don't just go around just biting everyone. They pick their fights. They actually run away from most human beings in most times. However, only when it's absolutely necessary will they actually attack. And us too, we have to realize we need to pick our fights. And when we pick them, we need to be as shrewd as snakes. So let me give you an example of this, how God taught Samuel how to be as shrewd as a snake. So let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. And this is when God wanted Samuel to anoint a new king. And he said, go to Bethlehem, and there's Jesse, and I want you to anoint one of the sons. Now, in verse 2, what does Samuel say? He says, God, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. And he'll probably kill King David too. So then God gives him a shrewd way of doing it. And what did he say? Take a sacrifice with you and just tell him you're going to sacrifice. So instead, he takes a heifer with him, goes to sacrifice, and then invites Jesse to come with him. It was done in a very shrewd manner because, think about it, Saul would have killed him. There would be no way of this happening. In the same way, this happens today too to a lot of Christians. Think about this. We are called to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, but there are many countries that don't want us to preach. So what do? Well, if you're unwise, if you're not shrewd, you'll go to North Korea to their borders and protest, freedom of religion, let us in to preach the gospel. But how long do you think you'd wait? You would never get in. If you waited till the North Korean government said, okay, we give up, come in, you would never get in. So what do we do instead? We do the same thing as Samuel. We make English schools and tourism. We help the country as the main reason we're there. And then in our spare time, in our daily life, we share and we testify of what God has done in our life. We do the exact same thing. We're not going to protest to the North Korean government. We're not going to protest to China. No, we have to do it in a shrewd way, like snakes. Are we trying to be wicked and evil? No, it's the characteristic of that snake that we have to become like in order to fulfill what we need to do. And this is a natural, normal thing that all human beings do. And God says, be as shrewd as snakes, but be innocent as doves. Don't go around doing these illegal things, right? Killing people or, breaking and entering and these types of things. No. Do it in a normal, innocent way, but be shrewd as snakes so you can get these things done. All right? So that is the end of today's talk. I hope that really helped you out to understand what did Jesus mean, be as shrewd as snakes, right? It's not that easy if our mind and our imaging is, it's Satan. But now that we understand this, I hope that all of us too can live our life in this world as sheep among wolves, shrewd as snakes, and innocent as doves. All right? Everyone have a wonderful week. Hope to see you guys again next week. This is Pastor Sky. These are my two sidekicks. Have a wonderful time. See you again. Bye-bye.